Well, hiya, BookTube. Bill Ruttenberg here with the Ruttenberg Library. Wanted to come to you and talk to you about a series of books, a trilogy by Stephen Ambrose. It was a three-part series on Richard Nixon. And I finally finished Ruin and Recovery, 1973 to 1990. And I say recently, what was it, a month ago? Maybe even 2 months ago, I can't remember. But I finished this. As I was doing this, I like Stephen Ambrose, and it become my goal a few years ago to read this series, and then I'm going to start on the Eisenhower series here soon, this next year. And I've been trying to read all of Ambrose's books. I like him as a historian. And this one was on my radar, and I ended up buying all 3 volumes. So every summer after school was out, I started reading. 3 years ago I read volume 1, and then the next year I read volume 2, and then this summer I was working on volume 3. And these tended to stretch out. It's not a fast-paced book at all, and so for me, and it's not, honestly, it's not the era that I usually read about. I don't usually read about the 1900s. I'm more of the 17 and 1800s. And so these books, I did not read them very quickly. But with that being said, they were very good. And I would like to preface this with Stephen Ambrose was admittedly not a Nixon fan at all. And the book publishers, when they came to ask him to write a biography on Nixon, he had said that he did not want to do it. He didn't think he was the right person to do it. It wouldn't be smart to have him do it because he had a hatred for Nixon. And he tells stories in some of his other, like in his memoirs, where he was even at some press conferences, and he was not a fan of Nixon. We'll just keep it at that. But as he wrote this series, that comes out a little bit. You do catch that as you're reading the books. But also in his memoirs, he mentions that by the end of this trilogy that he writes, because it was supposed to be only 1 volume to begin with, and all 3 books are thick like this. So the 3rd volume is 667 pages, and the other 2 are just as thick, if not thicker. And he put it into 3 volumes because there was just so much stuff to research. And by the end of doing all of this, he does admit that he somewhat admires him, and he finds maybe an appreciation for him. Doesn't mean he's a fan, but he understood him a little bit better. And so this book chat, I want to talk about all 3 of the volumes. I only have volume 3 downstairs with me right now. The other 2 are upstairs, but I'll put the picture up here. So in volume 1, Ambrose starts off with Nixon's childhood in California, and he talks about a lot of family events and the background of his parents and how that really influenced him as a youth, and how he was really shy to begin with, and he had to build up those skills to get over that shyness, and he becomes very good at speech and debate type stuff, and he really harnesses that. And so he comes out of those California roots, and he ends up going to college and gets a degree as a lawyer, and gets into politics early on, and he finds this fascination with the love of the dirty side of politics, and that really obviously plays later in his career as we head towards volume 3, that dirty side of politics. But he does not pull any punches when he talks about how Nixon won his elections. He's pretty upfront about it. And Nixon also served in the military, and talks about he really plays up that part when he was in the military, the playing cards and playing poker with everybody, and that getting to read people and getting to, even through his own emotions, mask his emotions, and just the ability to not only read them but play them with his, with what he is showing up front. And so politics is almost like a card game to him, and he is a master poker player, so to speak. And that book will end up going through the first volume, goes through his early life in politics, and then gets him into Congress. It plays a lot on the Alger Hiss case and what that meant to just his overall career later on, and the chasing of communists. And he becomes pretty famous for that, chasing communists, and it's the right case at the right time for his political career, and it really catapults him to the national stage, not only in the Alger Hiss case, but then also he gets put on as Dwight Eisenhower's vice presidential candidate. And Eisenhower, as Ambrose goes through the book, Eisenhower kind of has a mixed relationship with Ambrose, or not with Ambrose, with Nixon, excuse me. Ambrose plays on that mixed relationship between these two political giants, and Eisenhower, he kind of, to me, he puts it up that Eisenhower likes that Nixon would get down and dirty, but Eisenhower doesn't want any part of it. And I don't even know if he likes the down and dirty politics, but he likes the outcome of the down and dirty politics, where Eisenhower comes out smelling rosy and ends up winning elections because of some of the behind the scenes stuff that Nixon's doing. And so he plays on that whole case. He talks about he really plays up in that first volume that Nixon's foreign policy experience, and of course that's going to play later in when he becomes president. But Nixon is a master at foreign policy and understanding other nations and communism around the world. He becomes really, the master of this, and probably the best politician, or according to Ambrose anyway, this is what I was kind of taken out of it, that he becomes the sage of dealing with the situation. And he does a good job of showing how Nixon adjusts his politics accordingly. And I found all that pretty fascinating. That I learned a lot, because I'd never read, this was the first time I'd read a biography on Nixon, and I hadn't read too much on that time period, because like I said, my readings are more for 17 and 1800s. I'm not as well read in the 1900s, so I learned a lot from this 3-part biography. But it talks about Nixon was one of the best well-traveled politicians in the history of the United States in some of the trips that Eisenhower sends him on. It tells an interesting case. One of the most interesting stories to me was when he was down in South America, and the political upheaval that was going on in South America while he was vice president. And he was down there trying to show that the United States is here to help and all of this, and the people just hated him, and just that sticks out in my mind. As the thing progresses, as the first book progresses, it gets towards the end, and it talks about his run at the 1960 presidential election, that one of the tightest races in U.S. history between him and John F. Kennedy. And it really plays on how a lot of the policies of the two, as far as foreign policy, a lot of their stuff was very similar. It ended up being very similar, but Nixon, because he was vice president, and a lot of stuff was kept behind closed doors, and you couldn't, it was top secret stuff. There was a lot of stuff he could not put out as information for the public, because it was still top secret, and it was still being dealt with. And so he couldn't. Ambrose, I felt, played it off as he was or he was in a fight without all of his weapons. He couldn't use all his weapons against Kennedy, and that kind of hindered his presidential campaign. And so, as we know, John F. Kennedy defeated Richard Nixon, and Richard Nixon then went on to run, I believe it was for the governorship, and lost that as well. And that's where the first volume leaves off. And that brings us to the second volume of the trilogy. And in the second volume, it really is all about Nixon and recovery. he goes back to his lawyer roots. He moves to New York. He starts building up this this reputation for himself, building up his finances, and then he starts getting people around him. I call him his I call them his henchmen. They were his minions that were all around him. And he builds that all up in between his unsuccessful run for the presidency in 1960 and when he successfully runs later on in 1968. And so this whole time it's going to talk about the build up there. And of course Vietnam starts playing heavily into this. And he does a really good job, I think, of talking about the relationship between Nixon and Johnson and how he already starts planting this idea of the tapes and how previous presidents had already taped conversations in the White House and all that, and then using the IRS as a weapon, against your enemies and stuff. He starts planting this early on, so when we get to book 3 and all of this blows up in Nixon's face, it gives him reason to point back and say, well, those guys did it, and it was very, very interesting. Again, I've not read anything on this time period, so this is kind of my first dipping my toe in, so to speak. But it gets into the second volume, then moves on into the 68 election and all of the stuff that entails the 68 election, and then it really plays up that first term as president and the goods and the bads and the uglies of that first term. And really it's all about Vietnam and can we get out of Vietnam and the increase in the soldiers and then trying to bring them back home, but yet win a war with honor, winning the war with honor. That was kind of what Nixon was all about. He was so afraid of being embarrassed or losing something that nobody else had lost. Nobody else had lost a war, really, and he didn't want to be the first. And so Nixon, as he's going through this, that's where he leaves off, is after that first term as president, and then it gets us into our third term. It gets us into our third volume of the series, which is, like I said, Ruin and Recovery, 1973 to 1990. And this book is all about Watergate. It talks about his run for the presidency, that second term, but it sets the whole thing up. And I can't remember how many pages I said it was. If it was it 450 pages of nothing but Watergate? Is that what it was? It was something like that. And then the last 100 pages, 150 pages or so was about his after Watergate and trying to recover his reputation and trying to become kind of a goodwill ambassador for the United States. I got to be honest, with never reading anything about Watergate before, I did learn a lot, but oh my goodness, it was a lot of stuff on Watergate. I think it was 450. It might have been 350 pages on Watergate. I can't remember, but anyway, around it, that was a lot of stuff on Watergate, and I thought that maybe some other stuff could have been covered a little bit better, but I mean, that's the author's choice, and that was the hot button issue that really made Stephen Ambrose, aside from the Vietnam War itself, really hate Nixon. And so it made sense why he did a lot on it, but I thought it almost drowned me in information on Watergate. It almost becomes confusing because there's so much, but he does do a very thorough job on this. Again, his opinion floats in there. You can feel that opinion in it, but at the same time, it was the opinion of a lot of people around America. At the end of the book, he does give some props to Nixon and gives him some credit for the positive things that he does during his presidency. So if you are looking for a large series to read on Nixon, this might be your choice. Stephen Ambrose's Trilogy on Nixon. It was fairly thorough, a little bit one-sided, admittedly, but for going into the project as one-sided as he was, I thought he did ride the middle ground fairly well, considering. So For me, I would probably put this series at 4 out of 5 stars. And I give the 4 only because there were parts of all 3 of the books that when I got to the middle, I had to put these books down for a week because it just started dragging, and the pace of the book did not stay. And again, that could be just my interests, but I thought it slowed down a little bit, and so it wasn't quite as readable as it could have been. But anyway, I give it a 4 out of 5. I would recommend people to check it out. I think it's a good series, and Ambrose does a good job. So anyway, thank you for watching BookTube. I hope everyone's having a great day. Happy reading.